as you and I look down at the gray expanse of the lunar surface through the station viewport, it hits me that we are not the first to claim this territory. Long before we arrived to build our new home in the void, Chinese robotic explorers had practically taken over the moon. They have been crawling across that silent terrain for years, venturing into mysterious regions we previously knew nothing about. They mapped the unknown, made incredible discoveries, and most crucially, they scraped the surface to collect samples of ancient rock and dust. Those robotic pioneers sent their haul back down to Earth, handing our scientists the very keys we needed to finally leave our home world and survive out here, inside those tiny, sterile containers of lunar soil. Researchers found something entirely unprecedented. It was a revelation that did not just change how we view the barren sphere we now orbit, but one that carried a massive impact for the future of life on Earth and our ability to transcend it. The terrifying and beautiful truth about our moon is that the closer we get, the more we learn, the deeper its mysteries seem to run. We always looked up at the night sky thinking the cosmos was strange, but sitting up here in the dark, you realize that Earth itself is the true anomaly. It is a very weird planet, and not just because it bred us. Our home world is not just unusual because it harbors oceans, forests, and billions of breathing humans. Earth is an oddity because it outright refuses to behave like any of the other rocky planets floating in the inner solar system. And as we stare out at our massive, cratered gray partner hanging in the blackness, we know the moon is mostly to blame for this strange reality. Take Venus, for example. If you look at the raw data, Venus should be the most Earth-like planet in our entire cosmic neighborhood. It shares nearly the exact same size and weight, wrapped in a thick atmosphere. It is the perfect twin on paper, yet for all its structural similarities, Venus travels through the dark alone. It has no moon to anchor it. Mars is also fiercely Earth-like in its own way. It is a bit smaller, coming in at roughly half the size of our blue marble, and the red planet actually possesses 2 moons of its own. But out here, perspective is everything, and those Martian moons are incredibly small. Most people living down in the gravity well never realize this, but the largest moon of Mars is barely 22 kilometers across, and the smaller one spans a meager 12 kilometers. You could easily pluck both of those tiny orbital rocks out of the sky and drop them entirely inside the city limits of Chicago. If we zoom our sensors out toward the outer system, the frozen gas giants certainly possess massive moons. But they are also unfathomably larger planets. Jupiter, a churning nightmare of toxic storms, is 318 times more massive than the Earth we just left behind. And yet, despite that immense gravitational power, its largest moons are remarkably similar in size to our own solitary companion. When you really sit and think about the physics required to make that happen, it sounds deeply weird. And let me tell you, as someone staring into the void every single day, it is incredibly weird. Our moon breaks all the accepted rules of planetary architecture. For generations, brilliant minds have been desperately trying to piece together just what is going on out here and how Earth ended up in such a profoundly unusual cosmic situation. That burning question is exactly why we are out here, studying the moon today. When NASA strapped those first brave astronauts into rockets and sent them to walk the lunar dust in the 1960s and 70s, they hauled back massive crates of rock, back in the safety of terrestrial labs. The very first thing that shocked the scientific community was the chemistry those lunar fragments shared. Absolutely identical characteristics to the rocks. Buried deep beneath our own feet on Earth, that single revelation sent shockwaves through everything we thought we understood. It was completely unexpected. If these two celestial bodies had formed separately in different pockets of the ancient solar nebula, they would have inevitably been forged out of totally different elemental materials. They would possess entirely unique chemical fingerprints. Instead of being family, they would be more like two random strangers who happened to drift past each other in the freezing void of space, getting caught in a mutual gravitational embrace and simply deciding to spend eternity orbiting one another. But the hard data proved that this was not a story of strangers meeting in the dark. We have long believed that the wandering stranger scenario is exactly how most planet and moon relationships are born across the galaxy, but since the Earth and the moon are composed more like identical twins, logic dictates they must have been violently birthed at the exact same time in the exact same place. But how could a twin that large just suddenly appear? The prevailing theory that emerged from the shadows of those early Apollo missions painted a truly apocalyptic picture. It suggested that an infant Earth must have been catastrophically impacted by a rogue, wandering planet roughly the same size as Mars. A collision so violent, it almost ended our world before it even began. Floating out here, it is terrifying to picture that ancient devastation, this planetary car crash, would have taken place just a couple 100 million years after the chaotic formation of our solar system, when the space around us was a shooting gallery of fiery debris. The exact, brutal mechanics of this collision have been the subject of fierce debate among astronomers for many decades. Every variable changes the survival math, but just a couple of years ago, before we finally launched our own massive colony ships, the parameters of this terrifying theory were fed directly into the core matrix of an impossibly powerful supercomputer back on Earth. We watched the screens as that machine hummed with the power of a tiny star, running millions upon millions of violent simulations. It smashed digital planets together over and over again, tweaking angles and velocities until it finally arrived at an outcome that perfectly replicated everything we now know about the Earth and the moon orbiting outside my window. The mathematics of survival aligned at last. In the scientific community, we now refer to this flawless computer rendering of our apocalyptic genesis as the Big Splash. It is the violent birth certificate of the very cosmic neighborhood we are finally learning to survive and conquer. The sheer amount of kinetic energy released by that ancient impact instantly liquefied both planets, turning our world into a boiling ocean of magma. The blinding force of the collision splashed a colossal chunk of Earth's mantle outward into the freezing vacuum of space, while the crushed remains of the rogue planet were totally absorbed, sinking heavily into Earth's molten core. So, as we look down at the craters today, we realize the moon is essentially a bleeding fragment of a mini-Earth that broke off and then miraculously evolved right alongside our original planet, eventually cooling and solidifying into the beautiful gray, rocky expanses we are now learning to walk upon. But any pioneer standing out here in a pressure suit will tell you that for all of their shared chemical DNA, the moon is obviously a radically different world than the Earth. Now, it is crucial to remember that everything we just visualized is still an evolving, leading theory. It remains unproven by absolute physical law. Although what this violent history does tell us with absolute certainty is that the more deeply we dig into the scorched origins of the moon, the more clearly we will understand exactly how our own lush planet came to survive its chaotic birth, to know the moon is too. Finally understand the fragile miracle of the world we just left behind, that hunger for survival and knowledge pushes us outward, and for the critical past 5 years, it has been the Chinese Space Agency boldly leading the vanguard of modern lunar research. They recognized that the future of humanity depended on these answers, so they invested massive amounts of time, unprecedented energy, and untold fortunes to successfully reach the jagged surface with highly advanced robotic explorers. They were determined to scrape the dirt and seek out the answers to these cosmic mysteries before anyone else. To truly grasp what they found, you and I need to turn our attention away from the familiar Earthlight and begin our journey on the lonely far side of the moon. This hidden hemisphere is a jagged, unforgiving region that the Chinese scientific community has been obsessively interested in conquering through sheer engineering brilliance. They became the first nation in history to safely reach the treacherous far side, and they even brought back raw material that our structural engineers are still studying today to build better habitats. Now I have to clear up a massive misconception. In spite of what classic Pink Floyd albums or blockbuster Transformers movies might have told you when you were growing up, this hidden expanse is absolutely not the dark side of the moon. Light finds its way out here, just like everywhere else in the void. In reality, the far side is bathed in plenty of blinding radiation and harsh sunlight. The only difference is that it simply never sees the Earth, just as the Earth never gets to look back at it. So, according to the standard rules of orbital physics, there should be no real structural difference between the near side we gaze at from our terrestrial porches and the far side hiding in the black. But the universe loves to break its own rules. Ironically, it is actually us on Earth who have been looking at the true dark side all along, because the familiar face of the moon we know so well was painted by massive, low-lying plains of frozen ancient lava that stained the surface black. Yes, you heard that right. This dead, silent rock we are currently orbiting used to be violently alive with erupting volcanoes. We will dive deeper into that fiery past shortly, but when you finally cross the Terminator line and look down at the far side, you notice immediately that there are hardly any of those smooth, dark basaltic plains. Instead of lava lakes, the terrain stretching out beneath the stars is overwhelmingly light gray, violently scarred and dotted with thousands upon thousands of jagged asteroid impact craters. It looks like a massive cosmic shield that has been taking relentless enemy fire for billions of years, protecting the delicate Earth hidden behind it. So just by looking out the window, we know for a fact that there is a severe geologic difference between the protected side of the moon that permanently faces the Earth and the battered side that faces away toward deep space. But what exactly caused this terrifying split personality? Humanity took its first real step toward answering that when the Chang'e 4 mission bravely touched down on the far side in January of 2019. It was a flawless descent, marking the very first spacecraft from Earth to ever achieve that terrifying blind landing, and serving as the second major Chinese mission to successfully embed itself into the lunar surface. Once the dust from the landing thrusters finally settled in the vacuum, Chang'e 4 deployed a rugged little rover called U-22, which bravely set off on a lonely journey across the massive Von Orman crater. Looking at the telemetry maps, this crater boasts a staggering width of 180 kilometers, which is pretty much equivalent to driving the entire length of Cuba. And this particular depression is just one small puddle inside the Moon's South Pole basin. That basin itself is a gigantic cataclysmic impact crater, nearly 4 billion years old, covering a terrifying diameter of roughly 2,500 kilometers, or just slightly less wide than the whole of India, staring down into that impossibly massive scar from orbit. It is easy to understand the sheer scale of the violence that shaped our solar system. The primary reason that scientists back on Earth are so completely fascinated by this specific ancient impact zone is because of the incomprehensible force involved. The giant rogue asteroid that crashed into the Moon to create this basin was moving with such terrifying momentum that it would have penetrated as deep as 13 kilometers straight down into the lunar surface. It essentially shattered the outer armor of the Moon, digging deeper into the alien bedrock than humanity has ever managed to drill on our own home planet by cracking the planetary shell wide open. That apocalyptic strike ended up exposing pristine rock from incredibly deep within the lunar crust, and out here beneath the dead surface is exactly where the Moon hides its most fascinating, vital secrets for our survival, what the mechanical eyes of the U-22 rover ultimately found scattered in the shadowed base of that crater is actually believed by geologists to have been violently dredged up from the lunar mantle itself. For context, the mantle is that thick, mysterious region of dense, semi-solid rock that serves as a barrier, safely separating the battered outer crust from the churning, metallic mysteries of the inner core. Holding the analytical data in our hands, we realized history had just been made. This was the absolute first time that heavy rock from the lunar mantle had ever been positively identified on the surface of the Moon. Materials like this were never present in any of the countless pristine samples carefully collected by the original Apollo astronauts decades ago. Finding pieces of the Moon's inner guts scattered in the dirt was more than just a lucky break. It was a massive revelation, and it was just enough to massively pique the burning curiosity of desperate scientists back on Earth, leaving them hungering for more answers from the treacherous, unmapped shadows of the far side. Speaking of human curiosity, that little U-22 rover also witnessed something genuinely unnerving while crawling across the Moon in December of 2021. It suddenly transmitted a grainy photograph of something that vividly appeared to be a perfectly geometric, cube-like structure looming out there. In the distant gray wasteland, it looked like something uniquely, terrifyingly unnatural. Up here, your mind immediately races to the worst-case scenario. Could this actually be the terrifying alien monolith that Stanley Kubrick had famously predicted in 2001, A Space Odyssey? We all held our breath until higher-resolution images proved it was, thankfully, just a rock. I am not going to lie to you. For a couple of agonizing weeks up here, the unknown reality of that image really had all of us going. We were bracing for first contact. Ultimately, what we saw turned out to be a classic visual illusion, a simple trick of harsh, unfiltered solar light and pitch-black shadow. This was compounded by the basic hardware fact that digital camera sensors capture the universe using square pixels. So any jagged object rendered at the very edge of a low-resolution lens is naturally going to block out and look like an artificial square. The terrifying geometry vanishes the moment you get your machine close enough to actually illuminate its real weathered shape. Anyway, that tantalizing brush with the unknown only fueled the fire. And the direct result here was a highly ambitious return mission to the treacherous lunar far side in 2024 with Chang'e 6, I remember watching the telemetry as the heavy lander successfully touched down in the jagged South Pole Basin, just like its predecessor had done. Only this time, the stakes were infinitely higher, because the Chinese robotics would be actively drilling, collecting pristine samples, and launching them back across the void to Earth. This would represent the first ever geological material from the hidden far side that had ever made its way directly into human hands. When those sealed return capsules finally parachuted down to the terrestrial surface, what the Chinese scientists found inside was a vastly different kind of rock than absolutely anything that had ever been collected on the familiar near side. Back in the day, the heroic American Apollo astronauts brought back hundreds of pounds of lunar rock and abrasive dust from the various, relatively flat locations where they had touched down around the lunar equator region. For over 50 long years, the scientific community smugly thought that we had a pretty rock-solid idea of exactly what the entirety of the moon was fundamentally made of. We thought we had the cosmos figured out. But out here in the brutal vacuum of space, arrogance is a liability, and it turns out we were only getting half the true geological story. The freshly delivered material from the far side was not only drastically lighter in its visual color than the near-side dirt, but it also possessed a completely alien, highly unexpected texture. The very first impressions recorded by the bewildered Chinese scientists back in their sterile labs revealed that the toxic dust and shattered rock from the far side is noticeably thicker, strangely stickier to the touch, and contained far more hard, condensed lumps than any of the previously cataloged moon samples we had grown so used to studying. The surprises buried in those soil samples just kept coming, reshaping the blueprints we rely on to survive up here. Our orbital scans had already confirmed that there is significantly less frozen volcanic rock spread across the scarred geography of the far side, but when the lab technicians finally managed to isolate and date the rare, microscopic samples of crystallized lava that the Chinese probes actually did manage to find hidden in the sticky dust, the data shifted our entire timeline. Those deep space fragments have completely shocked the scientific world because they have turned out to be much, much younger than anyone had ever reasonably expected them to be. You see, the generally accepted theory that kept our textbooks thick was that the far side of the moon must have cooled down much faster than the side tightly locked facing the Earth. The logic was that the infant Earth itself was still an incredibly hot, violently glowing orb of volcanically active sludge during those early millions of years, radiating immense heat outward. So what researchers logically expected to pull from the dirt on the far side would be the absolute oldest, most ancient volcanic material anywhere on the moon. And to be fair, they actually did find exactly that. One specific, tiny fragment of hardened lava recovered by Chunga 6 reliably dates back an astonishing 4.2 billion years. That specific speck of ancient debris currently holds the profound title of being the oldest moon rock discovered by humanity so far. It is a terrifying window into the very birth of our orbital neighborhood, but while digging through the rest of the payload, researchers also found a completely unexpected volume of relatively young volcanic rock scattered across the far side, clocking in with an average youthful age of just 2.8 billion years. In geological terms, that is drastically younger than a huge portion of the classic samples collected by the Apollo astronauts on the near side, which typically proved to be well over 3 billion years old. The math was breaking down. So, as we float up here looking at the data streams, the terrifying picture that we are starting to slowly reveal is a fractured moon that somehow remained violently hot and dangerously molten for a much longer stretch of cosmic time than anyone previously believed possible. And that stubborn geological reality actually goes incredibly hard against a lot of what the classic Big Splash theory is desperately trying to tell us, because if the early Earth and the Moon did indeed form at the exact same time from the exact same apocalyptic impact, and the Moon is so much physically smaller than the Earth, then the laws of thermodynamics insist it should have cooled down and solidified much faster, especially out on the freezing far side. Stick with me here because this is where our understanding of the universe threatens to unravel entirely. All of the hard evidence locked inside those tiny grains of far side dirt loudly screams that the rapid cooling model is not what actually happened in the violent infancy of our solar system. The moon stayed hot, stubbornly defying the cold vacuum of space, hiding thermal secrets deep beneath its gray crust that we are only now beginning to exploit for our own survival, to figure out how this dead world managed to keep its internal fires burning for so long against all logic. Our investigation naturally brings us right back around to the illuminated plains of the near side. As we gaze down at those massive gray shadows from the station, we have to admit a humbling truth. Most of what humanity thought we knew about our lunar neighbor comes from the legendary Apollo astronauts, but their physical exploration was incredibly limited by primitive technology. To ensure survival, mission control could only land safely on the massive, flat plains at the lunar equator. Those safe zones tragically tend to be the absolute least interesting places when it comes to deep science and violent geology. Even with 3 later Apollo crews having the luxury of driving a specialized car around on the moon, the combined surface area physically explored by human boots across all those historic missions covers pathetic 25 kilometers. To put that tiny footprint into a perspective that anyone from Earth can understand, that total area of human exploration is barely 1/5 the size of the Disney World Resort in Florida. Think about how massive and diverse our home planet is. From boiling deserts to crushing oceanic trenches. If some heavily armed alien scout ship had blindly landed on Earth, let its crew walk around the plastic streets of the Magic Kingdom for a few short hours and then confidently reported back to their empire that they completely understood the entirety of the human world. That obviously would not make much sense, yet for decades that is exactly what our own species did regarding the vast, deadly world we now call home. I am looking at the screens, watching as we rewrite everything we thought we knew about the desolate world above us. The Chinese missions are leading this charge, unearthing secrets that change our destiny. Take the Chang'e 5 mission, for example. It was the first time since the mid-1970s that a piece of the lunar surface was brought back home, because there were no human lives at risk on this uncrewed landing. The robotic explorer could be sent into much more treacherous, geologically fascinating terrain. It touched down at the Lunar Dome, a surprisingly young volcanic formation rising from the northwest region of the near side. We are watching our robotic scouts map the very places we will soon call home. You have to understand that when we talk about volcanoes on the moon, we are not looking at the same raging beasts we know down here on Earth. I watch the telemetry data and marvel at how alien this terrain truly is. Our earthly volcanoes violently erupt, blasting ash up into the sky and leaving behind steep, jagged mountains of cooled rock that tear at the clouds, but up there in the cold vacuum of space, the geology tells a much quieter, stranger story. There is no explosive fury, no towering peaks born of sudden destruction. Instead, the forces that shape this barren world operated with a slow, creeping inevitability, laying down a foundation that humanity must now learn to navigate and survive upon. Instead of explosive peaks, a lunar volcano forms over a fragile, thin spot in the crust. Over millions of years, lava slowly escapes and bleeds out into the vacuum, spreading into an incredibly wide and flat dome. And what Chung 5 pulled from the shadows of the Lunar dome changed everything. It secured a sample roughly 2 billion years old, the youngest lunar rock ever held in human hands. Watching the scientists analyze this ancient stone, I realized the profound truth it reveals. The moon has not been a cold, dead rock for nearly as long as we previously believed. It had a beating heart long after we thought it died. And that lingering warmth might just be the key to our survival up there. Stick with me here because you and I are about to uncover what really changes the game for our future in space. China is not just mapping the surface, they are fundamental lie redefining what the moon is actually made of. As humanity prepares to leave the cradle of Earth, we are finding that the cosmos has hidden entirely new building blocks right next door. One of the very first major breakthroughs from the Chang'e lunar soil sample was the discovery of an entirely new mineral. It is a substance that has absolutely never been seen before. Not anywhere on our home planet, and never in any previous samples taken from the moon. It is an alien material that could unlock the door to our permanent presence in the stars. They gave this alien crystal a name, Chang'e. When you picture a moon rock, you probably imagine the dull, lifeless gray dust captured in those old photographs. But this is completely different. I stare at the magnified images, mesmerized. It is a crystal, perfectly transparent and entirely colorless, looking like a tiny shard of glass born from the stars. The only piece of Chang'e that humanity currently possesses is microscopically small, measuring significantly less than the width of a single human hair. Yet, despite its incredibly fragile size, this microscopic sliver holds enough data to tell us something massively important about the future of human energy and our ability to thrive in the terrifying dark. Locked inside that tiny, invisible crystal is a tremendously rare element known as helium-3. And the reason our brightest minds are so desperate to harvest this stuff is that it holds the incredibly beautiful potential to create unlimited, clean energy. For decades, dreamers have looked up at the night sky, considering helium-3 to be the single most valuable resource the lunar surface has to offer. It does not originate on the moon, but comes directly from the raging furnace of our sun. It is carried across the void of space and violently deposited onto the dusty lunar plains by relentless solar winds. This invisible power source is exactly what we need to keep the lights on when we finally leave our world behind. We do not have any naturally occurring helium-3 down here on Earth, and the reason why is a beautiful cosmic irony. Our planet is wrapped in a powerful magnetic field that absolutely blocks those brutal solar winds from ever reaching the surface. That invisible shield is one of the most important forces keeping us alive, protecting our fragile bodies from lethal cosmic radiation. But out there, in the unprotected wastelands where we must learn to build our new homes, the moon absorbs it all. The harsh reality of helium-3, however, is that it is not an easy fix. To actually release its full energy potential, we would need a fully functional nuclear fusion reactor, a technology that feels just out of our desperate reach. That kind of sustained fusion technology simply does not exist right now, no matter how badly we need it to power our cosmic expansion. But when we finally crack that code, everything changes. I can see a future where we use this lunar element as a revolutionary nuclear fuel. It will generate massive, civilization-sustaining amounts of energy, all without any of the dangerous radiation or toxic radioactive waste that has always haunted our conventional nuclear power plants on Earth. It is the ultimate dream of clean power, a beacon of hope for humanity as we learn to live in space. So yes, that crystal is profoundly important, but it is a long game. We have more immediate survival problems to solve before we conquer fusion. What is far more relevant to us right now, at this exact moment in history, is what else the Chang'e 5 mission pulled from the dust. You and I both know that water means life, and against all odds they found water hidden in the lunar soil. And the wildest part is exactly where they found it. They did not discover it freezing in the bottom of a permanently shadowy crater at the poles, but resting right there on the sun-baked side of a dormant volcano. That changes the entire survival equation for humanity. It is a wildly optimistic indicator that there is at least some trace amount of water to be found pretty much everywhere across the entire moon. The terrifying desert of space is not entirely dry after all. I remember watching the data feed when they confirmed it. This was the very first time in human history that a complete, intact water molecule had been discovered up there in the lunar dirt. Decades ago, we had detected scattered traces of hydrogen and oxygen drifting around, but never actually locked together in the life-giving form of H2O. This definitive water was found trapped inside yet another newly discovered mineral called ULM1. The scientists identify it as a hydrated salt, which means that the precious water molecules are actually chemically bonded directly with the mineral itself. It is a tiny hidden oasis, locked inside a stone, waiting for us to figure out how to crack it open and survive. It is basically an alien combination of ice and rock, all fused into one impossible thing. And the strategic significance of this discovery cannot be overstated as we prepare to leave our home world. If water on the lunar surface is not incredibly scarce, if it is actually baked right into the dirt beneath our boots, then our future is wide open. It means that the brave people who go first can theoretically set up permanent base pretty much anywhere they want. We are no longer chained to the freezing, eternally shadowy craters at the lunar poles just to survive. The entire moon becomes a blank canvas for human habitation, a stepping stone that is much more forgiving than we ever dared to hope when we first looked up. All of these unbelievable discoveries feed directly into a much larger, far more ambitious reality. It is the primary reason that China, and soon the rest of humanity, is rushing back to the moon right now. Peering into the ancient history of our solar system is a beautiful endeavor, but meticulously planning for our species' future out there is arguably the most important task in human history. As I watch these ongoing missions, the truth is undeniable. The Chinese Space Agency is actively laying down a permanent framework for human habitation on the lunar surface. That is the terrifying and beautiful reality of what these robotic scouts are actually doing. They are the architects of our new world beyond the atmosphere. Let's look at this piece by piece, shall we? Decades ago, NASA bravely managed to get away with just landing people on the lunar surface and hoping for the best. But those legendary astronauts were only up there surviving for a few terrifying days at a time before racing back to Earth to live out there permanently. Is a totally different beast if you are truly serious about building a lasting moon base. If you want humanity to survive the cold vacuum of space, then you have to be aggressive. Lie serious about studying every single inch of the moon. And right now, as we stand on the absolute precipice of becoming an interplanetary species, it is China who is leading our way into the beautiful, unforgiving dark.